A young couple lived a peaceful life, sharing their home with a mysterious black cat that seemed to be more than just an ordinary animal. Everything began to change when the husband, who was once loving and attentive, fell into a drinking habit. Alcohol brought out the worst in him, transforming his temperament in frightening ways. In a night of uncontrolled rage, he committed an irreparable act. He took the cat's life. That moment was the trigger for a series of terrifying events that they could never have imagined. It is important that I tell this story. I do not seek recognition, nor do I expect anyone to believe every detail. In fact, even I sometimes doubt my own senses. But what happened is etched in my mind like a nightmare that never ends. I am at peace with the fact that tomorrow I may not be here anymore. Today, however, I need to get it off my chest. I just want to report what happened directly, without embellishments. It was something that destroyed my peace, consumed me, and left deep scars. Perhaps, to others, it may seem like just a series of macabre coincidences, but to me, it was a real and unbearable horror. I will leave it to someone more logical, someone with a less affected mind, to try to explain the reasons behind this. Ever since I was little, I have always been known for being kind and affectionate, especially with animals. This love was so striking that I sometimes became the butt of jokes. My parents, realizing my passion, allowed me to have many little animals. I spent my childhood surrounded by them, and my happiness was in caring for, feeding and playing with each one. This bond only strengthened when I became an adult. Anyone who has ever had a pet knows how special this pure, non-judgmental love is, unlike the fickleness that we often find in human relationships. When I got married, I found a partner who shared the same affection for animals. Our house was soon filled with them: little birds, fish, a friendly dog, rabbits, a little monkey, and, of course, a black cat named Pluto. He was impressive, with an intelligence that almost seemed human. My wife, although practical and not at all superstitious, joked about the old legend that black cats were witches in disguise. Pluto was my favorite. He followed me around the house like a shadow, and it seemed impossible to stay away from him. Our bond was unique, but that began to change as alcohol began to dominate my life. Over time, I became irritable, distant, and cold. I began to treat those I loved most badly, including my wife. The animals, who had previously been my source of joy, began to suffer with my change. I ignored them and, at times, took my anger out on them. But Pluto was still special to me, and for a long time, I managed to keep him from feeling the effects of my lack of control. However, alcohol continued to consume me, and my patience with Pluto, who was already old and sometimes insistent, eventually ran out. It was in this spiral of self-destruction that something terrible happened. One of those nights, coming home completely drunk after spending hours in a bar in the suburbs, I noticed that the cat avoided coming near me. Already overcome by drunkenness, I grabbed it tightly, but it, frightened, bit me lightly on the hand. That was enough to awaken an uncontrolled fury in me. At that moment, I no longer recognized myself. It seemed as if something evil had taken over my body, as if the drink had released an evil that I didn't even know existed. I took a pocket knife from my pocket, grabbed the poor animal by the throat and, without thinking, gouged out one of its eyes. To this day, my soul is ashamed when I remember that atrocity. The next morning, when the hangover hit and the euphoria of the binge wore off, I felt a mixture of horror and regret. But, to be honest, it was a shallow, superficial remorse. My soul seemed numb. It didn't take long for me to drown any trace of guilt in more drink, trying to erase the memory of what I had done. As the days went by, the cat began to recover. The wound, although horrible, no longer seemed to cause him pain. However, his attitude had changed. He kept as far away from me as possible, and this bothered me. At first, I still had traces of the gentle heart I had before and felt guilty for the repulsion he showed. But soon this guilt turned to irritation. It was then that something even darker took hold of me, an inexplicable feeling of wanting to do evil, just for the pleasure of going against everything that was right. It was as if there was a perverse impulse inside me, something that defied all logic or morality. Who has never done something wrong just because they knew it was forbidden? This feeling of rebellion, of wanting to defy the rules simply because they were rules, was what led me to make the cruelest decision of all. One morning, with a cool head, I took the cat and wrapped a rope around his neck. With tears streaming down my face and my heart heavy with remorse, I hanged him from a tree branch. I did it knowing that he loved me, knowing that he had never done anything to deserve it. I did it because I wanted to punish myself, because I knew it was a terrible sin, something that would put my soul at risk. That same night, I was awakened by the screams of fire. My room was in flames, and the fire was spreading rapidly throughout the house. My wife, the maid, and I barely escaped, but everything was destroyed. My entire fortune was reduced to ashes. I don't want to imply that the fire was a direct punishment for what I had done, but it is impossible not to connect the events. The next day, I returned to the place to see the rubble. Almost everything had collapsed, except for a relatively thin inner wall where the headboard of my bed had been. The plaster on that wall had resisted the fire better, perhaps because it was new. A crowd was gathered around this wall, staring at something in astonishment. The words strange and unbelievable caught my attention. As I approached, I felt my body shudder. Engraved on the surface of the wall, like a perfect bas-relief, was the image of a gigantic cat. The figure was so clear that it seemed surreal. And around the animal's neck was a rope, just like when I had hanged him. The first moment I came across that apparition, because I couldn't think of it as anything else, I felt absolute terror. However, my reason soon found an explanation. I remembered that I had hanged the cat in the garden of the house, and in the midst of the confusion caused by the fire, someone must have cut the rope and thrown the body out of my bedroom window, perhaps trying to warn me. The collapse of the walls, combined with the fresh plaster and the ammonia released by the decomposing body, probably resulted in the image etched on the wall, as clear as it was terrifying. Even trying to rationalize what had happened, the scene wouldn't leave my mind. For months, that ghost of the cat tormented me. I felt something like remorse, but it wasn't exactly that. It was a vague and uncomfortable sensation. Little by little, I began to mourn the loss of the animal, feeling an irrational need to find another similar one to replace it. One night, while drowning myself in alcohol in a dirty and run-down place, something caught my attention. On top of a large barrel of rum, a black figure was resting. I stared at it for a few minutes, puzzled as to why I hadn't noticed it before. I decided to approach it. When I touched the object, I realized it was a cat. A large cat, very similar to Pluto, except for one detail: it had a large white spot on its chest, unlike any other mark on the other. As soon as I touched it, the animal stood up, purred and rubbed itself against my hand, as if it already knew me. I felt a strange connection and, without hesitation, I wanted to take it with me. I asked the owner of the tavern if the cat was his, but he said he had never seen it before. Without any objection, I began to pet the animal and, as I was getting ready to leave, it followed me. On the way home, I stopped a few times to pet it and let it accompany me. As soon as we arrived, the cat quickly became familiar with the place and, to my surprise, became my wife's favorite. However, for me, the initial charm soon faded. Instead of feeling affection, I began to feel a growing dislike for him. I couldn't explain why, but his obvious friendliness bothered me deeply. As time went by, this dislike evolved into a silent hatred. Still, something inside me kept me from hurting him. Maybe it was the shame of what I had done before, or maybe it was the memory of that grotesque scene on the wall. For weeks, I avoided any physical contact with the cat, but I could not escape his presence. He seemed to follow me around incessantly, like an unwanted shadow. What further increased my aversion was when I discovered, the day after he arrived, that he was also blind in one eye, like Pluto. This discovery made my wife even more attached to the animal. She had a natural kindness, something I had long since lost, and she saw in the cat something worthy of compassion and care. For me, however, this only intensified my hatred. The cat followed me everywhere. Wherever I went, he was there. If I sat down, he would climb onto my lap. If I stood up, he would curl up between my legs, nearly tripping me. Sometimes, he would dig his claws into my clothes and climb up to my chest, as if to challenge me. As much as I wanted to end him, something held me back. It wasn't just the memory of my previous crime, but also an irrational fear that grew inside me. It was as if this animal carried something beyond its physical appearance, something that haunted me in ways I couldn't comprehend. This fear that consumed me was not exactly of something physical, and yet I could not define it in any other way. It is almost shameful to admit it, even here, in this condemned cell, but the horror that that animal caused me had been intensified by one of the most absurd ideas imaginable. My wife had pointed out on several occasions the curious shape of the white spot on the cat's fur, the one that distinguished him from Pluto. At first it was just a vague mark, without a defined shape. But gradually, so slowly that reason struggled to reject it as a figment of my imagination, the spot took on a clear, precise, unmistakable outline. It became the representation of something that filled me with dread. I hesitate to name it, but I must. It was the image of a gallows. The terrible machine of horror and death stamped on the body of that cat increased my repulsion and my fear. I detested and feared the animal as I had never feared anything before, but I did not dare to get rid of it. It seemed that the symbol engraved on its fur was not a coincidence, but a macabre omen, a living punishment for my sins. My anguish became unbearable. There was no rest for me, neither day nor night. During the day, the cat would not leave me alone, following me at every step. And at night, I would wake up from terrifying nightmares only to feel the weight of that creature on my chest, its hot breath against my face, like a demonic presence that I was unable to repel. Under the pressure of such intense torments, the last traces of goodness in me completely disappeared. I gave myself over to dark thoughts, to anger and hatred, not only for the cat, but for everything and everyone. My poor wife, patient and resigned, silently endured the outbursts of fury that became more and more frequent and uncontrollable. It was then that one day she accompanied me to the cellar of the old building where we lived, a run-down place that our poverty forced us to inhabit. The cat, as usual, followed us there. As I descended the steps, it wrapped itself around my feet, almost knocking me over. That gesture was the last straw. Blinded by hatred, I grabbed an axe that was nearby and, without thinking, raised it to kill it. However, just as I was about to strike, my wife intervened, grabbing my arm. This gesture, far from calming me, provoked in me an even more inhuman rage. In an act of pure insanity, I ripped my arm from her hands and, without hesitation, struck her. The axe struck her head with force. She fell dead instantly, without making a single sound. Faced with the heinous crime that I had just committed, my mind was filled with the need to hide the body. I could not remove it from the house without running the risk of being seen by the neighbors. Several ideas came to mind, cutting the body into pieces and burning it, burying it in the cellar floor, or even throwing it into the well in the courtyard. But in the end, I opted for a plan that I considered most effective, walling up the body, as monks in the Middle Ages are said to have done with their victims. The structure of the cellar was perfect for my purpose. The walls were rough and had recently been covered with plaster that was still damp from the humidity in the room. In addition, there was a protrusion on one of the walls caused by an old chimney that had been sealed. I decided that would be the place. With speed and determination, I removed the bricks of the false fireplace, placed my wife's body in the space, and walled it up again, taking care to make sure that the work was identical to the original. No matter how attentive, would be able to discover what I had done. And my calculation was correct. Using a hook, I was able to remove the bricks with ease. Carefully, I positioned the body against the inner wall, supporting it while I replaced the bricks in their original place. I worked meticulously, using mortar, sand and fiber to prepare a plaster identical to the previous one. When I was finished, I examined the result. The wall seemed untouched. I felt triumphant when I saw that there were no signs of the alteration. I cleaned the floor with great care, removing any evidence. I looked around with satisfaction and thought to myself, here, at least, my work was perfect. Then I decided to look for the cat, the cause of all this misfortune, with the intention of killing it. If I had found the damned animal at that moment, there would have been no doubt about its fate. However, it seemed to have sensed the intensity of my anger and, cunning as always, disappeared. The absence of the cat brought me a relief so profound that I can hardly describe it. For the first time since that monster entered my life, I was able to sleep a full night in peace, despite the weight of my crime. The days passed, and the cat was still missing. On the second day, the third, and even the fourth, its absence reinforced my feeling of freedom. I came to believe that it had fled for good, terrified by my fits of rage. This idea filled my heart with supreme joy. The guilt of the crime seemed insignificant compared to the relief of being free of that creature. Few questions arose about my wife's disappearance, and the answers I gave were enough to avoid suspicion. Even a quick search of the house yielded nothing. I was convinced that my secret was safe. However, on the fourth day after the crime, a group of police officers unexpectedly showed up to carry out a new investigation. Despite the surprise, I remained calm, confident in the perfection of my hiding place. The agents searched every corner of the house rigorously, but found nothing. When they went down to the cellar again, I followed them with unshakable confidence. My heart remained calm, like that of an innocent person. The police searched the cellar once more, but when they realized that there was nothing suspicious, they began to leave. Euphoria took hold of me. My self-confidence was so great that I felt the need to make a triumphant comment, something that would make my innocence clear. "Gentlemen," I said, as they went up the stairs, "I am pleased to have dispelled your suspicions. I wish you all good health and a little more courtesy. By the way, this house is very well built," I said, trying to sound natural, but without really controlling my desire to show off. "Yes, a solid and well-made construction. These walls, for example," and, seized by an impulse of bravado, I banged my cane hard on the wall that hid my wife's body. It was then that the unexpected happened. The sound of my knocks had barely faded when, on the other side of the wall, a terrible sound arose. At first it sounded like a muffled moan, something like the sobbing of a child. But it soon turned into a deafening, prolonged, grotesque scream, a sound that mixed horror and triumph, something that only hell could produce, a mixture of the wail of the damned and the cruel laughter of demons. Frozen with terror, I retreated, leaning against the opposite wall. For a brief moment, the policemen stood paralyzed, seized by the same terror that consumed me. Then, as if awakened by that infernal scream, they began to dismantle the wall with speed and vigor. When the barrier fell, my terrible secret was revealed. There lay the decomposing body of my wife, standing upright, smeared with dried blood. Over her head, like a macabre sentinel, stood the cat, the damned animal that had driven me to the crime. Its one eye glowed with fury, and its mouth opened in a demonic grin. He had been walled up along with the corpse, and now, with his telltale voice, he delivered me to my fate. For more stories and mysteries, subscribe to the channel.